here to get us all together, but we welcome you all to the second annual Eva Allerton Nursing Lecture. We are very grateful to be sponsored by the Rochester Medical Museum and Archives, along with the Rochester Academy of Medicine. Application for nursing continuing education is pending from Rochester Regional Health. Rochester Regional Health Nursing Institute is an approved provider of continuing nursing education by the ANA Massachusetts, an accredited approver by the American Nurses Credentialing Center Commission on Education. Completion of this program will award 1 continuing nursing education credit. Who was Eva Allerton? A graduate of one of the first Nightingale schools in the United States, the Boston Training School at Massachusetts General. She was well known as a teacher and administrator after she arrived in Rochester, New York in 1890 to become the nursing superintendent of the Rochester Homeopathic Hospital, which some of you may know as the Genesee Hospital. The meaning of the title of today's presentation, "Oh My Daughter, I Wish You Were a Boy," may not be well understood almost 200 years after they were uttered by Henry Stanton, the father of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mr. Stanton was grieving the death of his eldest son. At that time, women had no legal rights. They couldn't own land, nor did they have custody of their children. And yet, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would become one of the best known and most radical women's rights advocates of the 19th century. If Susan B. Anthony, who many of us know better, became the movement's most effective organizer, Stanton was its leading philosopher. The success of the suffragists led not only to the enfranchisement or the right to vote for women. We actually celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's right to cast the ballot last month in August of 2020. But it also led to a gradual shift in culture. For example, just last December, the Kaiser Family Foundation reported a survey that showed that there are now more female medical students than there are more female medical students than male, 50.4% to 49.6%. Now, our medical colleagues are very important to us as nurses, so we wanted to give them a shout out for coming into the 21st century. The success of suffragists was widespread, and to help us understand this time, we welcome this evening Dr. Gertrude Buck Hutchinson, an assistant professor in the Department of Nursing, Russell Sage College, to discuss those early connections between the active enthusiasm of nursing and women's suffrage. Dr. Hutchinson was an archivist for the Center for Nursing at Guilderland, New York. Welcome, Dr. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. And it's so good to finally be here virtually, although I know we would have all liked to have been in Rochester for this, but it is nice to be here with you virtually. I have to say that as I go through the presentation, the images that you see do all have citations for them, and they are available with the references that if you want, you'll email me for those. But you won't see the citations on the slides, but I do have them. So in the time that we have here this evening, I would like to share some of my research with you about some of the prominent civilian voices, if you will, and most importantly, since this is a nursing history conference, some well-known and lesser-known nursing voices active in the suffrage movement from the 1840s to 1920. I will speak briefly about local women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, their friend and colleague Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, and nurses such as Harriet Tubman, Lillian Wald, Lavinia Dock, Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger, Ida Bell Samuel Toms, and Hattie Francis Kruger. By the end of this talk, I hope you will have a deeper appreciation for these women, these nurse activists, and a greater commitment to using our hard fought for enfranchisement. So let's get started, shall we? In 1840, our nation was 64 years of age. Over half, all women and male citizens of color, had no rights recognized under the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. No rights to own property once a woman married. No right of the vote. Citizens of color had it even worse, as they were enslaved south of the Mason-Dixon line and were forbidden to learn to read and write. And if born free in the North, the specter of capture or kidnap always hung over their heads. Many voices started to speak out against these offenses. Those speaking out firmly believed that until women were recognized as full and equal citizens, America would not realize her full potential. One of these voices was Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Coffin Mott was a Quaker who was raised with the concept of equality between women and men, educated equally, became a minister in the Society of Friends and an abolitionist, and a leader of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. It was in that capacity that she attended the 1840 International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England. It was through her abolitionist work that she and her husband James met New York abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and Henry and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton and Mott's friendships forged on that trip were long and lasting. Excuse me. Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy. Can you imagine hearing those words when you were mourning the death of your brother? Can you imagine hearing those words, even though you realized the enormous grief which served as the nexus of those words? Can you imagine hearing those words as you were trying so hard to fill your brother's shoes with your female feet? Elizabeth Cady not only imagined, she heard them as they were directed at her. She would never be a judge like her father. She did become a wife and mother many times over, and an outspoken advocate for the rights of women, single, married, and women of color. Her writings were published in papers, in texts, and have been debated over the years. Her friendships with Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony have been the object of many keynotes over the years. Suffice it to say that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a force of nature and left a lasting effect. Some good, others deleterious, but she left a lasting effect wherever she went. One of her children, Harriet Stanton Blatch, carried on her work. I would now like to take a few moments to just share some thoughts about the place of Susan B. Anthony in this historical struggle. She was the daughter of a Baptist mother and a Quaker father. She lived in a loving home in Adams, Massachusetts from 1820 to 1845 when her family removed to Rochester, New York, where she spent the rest of her life. Except when she was traveling around the nation as a vocal advocate for women's suffrage. She was raised in a home where women and men lived equally respected. her love of and partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton has been well researched. Her adult life as a teacher, she started knowing pay inequality. She was paid 25 cents less per hour than the male teacher she replaced. During her 15 years as a teacher, she honed her speaking skills, and she believed in enfranchisement for women. And in 1872, she put her words into action. This year is the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment and an election year. We have the right to vote, but in 1872, Anthony did not. However, that didn't stop her. Ellen Du Bois, in her work, Notes from Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, records one event that ensured Anthony's place in history. The good trouble, to borrow the phrase from the late John Lewis, that caused her arrest, registering to vote, and casting her vote in Rochester, New York. And she wrote that morning to her friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, "Well, I've been and gone and done it. Positively voted the Republican ticket straight this morning at 7 o'clock. Not a jar, not a word, not a look, not disrespectful." However, just a fortnight later, Mr. Elisha Keeney knocked on her door. As a federal officer, he presented a warrant for arrest to Susan B. Anthony. And what was her crime? A violation of the 1870 Enforcement Act, which was meant to disenfranchise men who fought for the Confederacy. Needless to say, the news of her arrest made the news all over the country and ignited suffragists all over the nation. Sadly, however, she died 14 years before the 19th Amendment ratification. So who else spoke up? Please meet the woman who was born during 1797 in Ulster County, New York, thus increasing the chattel of the Hardenberg household by one slave named Isabel. This family was Dutch, hence Dutch was little Isabel's first language. This proved a significant detriment when she was sold at 10 years of age to an English-only speaking man who beat her for her incomprehension of English. At 12, she was sold to a Dutch-speaking tavern owner by the name of Martin Scriver. At 13, she was purchased by John Dumont. She served him for 16 years, and in 1826, 1 year before New York State abolished slavery, her youngest son, Peter, and she fled at the age of 39 to the refuge of a Quaker couple by the name of von Wegemann. Now, some sources record this name as von Wegener, but she worked in that Dutch household as a free woman and as a free mother. So, what turned this woman into an activist? What caused this woman to completely change her name? There were two events. First, her free son was captured and sold across New York state lines into slavery, which is a violation of New York state law. She tracked him. She fought his wrongful kidnapping and sale, and she won. The second event, She was heavily involved in African mysticism and mystical Christianity, where she honed her preaching and speaking skills. At this time, now 1843, she struck out on her own and changed her name to Sojourner Truth. Her oratorical skills and activist acumen on behalf of women's rights and enfranchisement made many men and women who were happy with the status quo very uncomfortable. One journalist made this comment after hearing her speak: "This unlearned African woman has magnetic powers over an audience and is perfectly astounding." She related in her narrative of ascending a podium in Akron, Ohio, to a chorus of boos and hisses. And she spoke to the daily inequality of treatment between white women and black women. Black women weren't lifted into conveyances. And she pulled up her sleeves and she showed her developed arms by flexing her biceps. She reproached the men about withholding rights from their mothers, sisters, and wives. But the point was made. At another meeting, when critics in the audience challenged her gender because of her oratorical skills, she shut them down immediately because she opened her dress and exposed her breasts to everyone. That took great courage and great conviction. Her last address as a proponent of women's rights and enfranchisement occurred at the 1878 National Women's Suffrage Association's convention in Rochester, New York. Are you noticing a theme here? Rochester's a hotbed, okay, for the suffrage movement. Acknowledging 1878 as the 30th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, she voiced her disappointment that enfranchisement had not yet been achieved. So now that we've completed a brief review of local and regional non-nurse activists, let's turn our attention to our sister nurse activists who championed the cause of enfranchisement for all women, and especially for nurses. Harriet Tubman is known as a major conductor of the Underground Railroad, who safely led hundreds of enslaved adults and children to freedom in the northern United States and Canada. Her infamy earned her a head bounty of $40,000. But despite that, she continued on as a nurse for those injured on the journey north, a voice for reason and for the abolition of slavery and enfranchisement for women. Researchers Goodyear and Pastorello discovered that she, quote, faithfully attended nursing suffrage meetings in upstate New York. And in 1905, at the 28th Annual New York State Woman Suffrage Association Convention, you guessed it, in Rochester, she was introduced as a living legend by none other than Susan B. Anthony. In 1906, she once again attended the Rochester gathering. However, this time, the attendees were horrified to learn that due to a lack of accommodations for women of color, that Harriet Tubman had to sit up all night at the train station until sunrise, at which time she walked from the train station to the site of the gathering. In her more senior years, as a result of receiving a $20 per month pension, she opened her home in Auburn, New York, to the care for the ill and the elderly. And this she did until she died. This indomitable woman died 6 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So who else came forward? Clara Barton, who is best known for her work as a nurse in the Civil War. And this shows her as a younger woman after she came back from the war. She's also known for her work in establishing the cemetery at Andersonville Prison and as the founding executive director of the American Red Cross. But did you know that Barton had a lifelong friendship with Susan B. Anthony? Barton didn't always utilize her platform in the same way that, Anthony thought that she should. But Barton went back to Nightingale. And as Nightingale admonished nurses to refrain from doing things that were deleterious, in Barton's perception, she wanted to refrain from doing things that could be considered deleterious to the women's suffrage movement. In 1866, Barton was asked this question: what would happen if women came to Congress? What would happen if women came to Congress? Her answer, which was recorded in Carp's Washington, and cited by Buckingham in his 1977 text on Barton, gave a very, very lengthy answer. But that didn't stop Barton. She still was pondering this question and gave a more definitive yet succinct answer to the attendees of the New England Women's Suffrage Association meeting in Boston, saying in 1888, quote, "This privilege, suffrage, for which women, of whom should I ask? Who possessed the right to confer it? Who had the greater right than woman herself? Was it men? And if so, where did he get it? Who conferred it upon him? He depended upon woman for his very being, existence, nurture, rearing. More fitting that she should have conferred it on him." And who was another dynamo for the cause? None other than Lavinia Lloyd Dock. Miss Lavinia Lloyd Dock packed a lot of life into her 98 years. She was born in the 19th century in 1858 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She was a woman of small stature who stood very tall and left a very large footprint on her chosen profession of nursing. She came from a loving, well-off family, one of 3 girls who chose to become a nurse and speak out against social injustice wherever she found it. She entered the Bellevue Training School for Nurses in New York City in 1883 and graduated in 1886. Upon graduation, she began her public health career as a nurse working with Miss Lillian Wald at the Henry Street Settlement. During this time, as Phoebe Pollitt points out in her work, Dock also became the author of Materia Medica for Nurses in 1890, and she started her work as an activist. She would later go on to author Hygiene and Morality and the History of Nursing with M. Adelaide Nutting. After 22 years working as a public health nurse, she left active nursing at the tender age of 50 to devote more time to her activism, such as championing an 8-hour workday, decreasing or eliminating child labor, improving women's health, and working to get women the vote. The picture on the left here shows her as a young woman shortly after she graduated from Bellevue. In 1907, Doc addressed the issue of women's enfranchisement and why nurses should be attentive to and involved in its attainment, writing, enfranchisement embraces the whole consideration of the many fields in which women are striving for a secure foothold, that they may live and express themselves and share those rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness which Thomas Jefferson declared as inalienable. She closed her missive with this exhortation. Let me leave you with this prophecy. Until we possess the ballot, we shall not know when we may get up in the morning to find that all we had gained has been taken from us. In that same year, Doc again championed the cause of enfranchisement from the convention platform of the Nurses Associated Alumni of the United States, the organization that in 1911 eventually became the American Nurses Association. She said this, I am ardently convinced that our national association will fail of its higher opportunities and fall short of its best mission if it restricts itself to the narrow path of purely professional questions and withholds its interest and sympathy and its moral support from the great, urgent, throbbing, pressing social claims of our day and our generation. I would like to have our journals not afraid to mention the words political equality for women. Although Doc received pushback from many of her colleagues at the convention and in the pages of AJN, she was undeterred. Sophia Palmer, who was the editor of the AJN in 1908, wrote in the September issue, quote, the letters which are appearing in the journal and which come to the editors personally on the suffrage question are evidence of a misunderstanding of the journal's position in this matter. This magazine is a professional journal devoted to the interests of nursing. On every nursing subject, it has a definite policy. On other broad questions, its attitude is neutral. Our correspondence is open to free expression of opinion, but it must be understood that the journal's policy editorially must of necessity remain neutral. So we're back to Lavinia. Wearing her suffrage banners and pins, Doc organized marches in New York City. In 1912, now at the age of 54, Doc joined about 500 women who marched in a cold, snowy December weather from New York City to Albany, covering 10 miles a day, arriving in Albany to meet with then Governor-elect William Sulzer to deliver their message of the necessity of women's enfranchisement. Suffice it to say that one march was not enough for Lavinia. She led another one 2 months later from Newark, New Jersey to Washington, D.C. She eventually moved to our nation's capital so that she could be closer to the action, and as she was an active member of the National Woman's Party, she felt that's where she needed to be. Women would silently protest in front of the White House, trying to move President Woodrow Wilson to endorse voting rights for women. Between 1917 and 1918, Doc was arrested 3 times, went on a hunger strike, and counted her arrests as the high point of her activist career. And she wrote in her handwritten 16-page autobiography of a dream that she had and a conversation with St. Peter that went like this. St. Peter would ask her, well, what is your record? Well, there are only two things I am really satisfied with. St. Peter asked her, well, what are they? And Doc said, well, doing the history of nursing with Miss Nutting and going to jail with the Woman's Party. She died in 1956 and is buried next to her two sisters. So she was able to see the passage of the 19th Amendment. And if they thought that the Lavinia Doc was a feisty little person, well, then we have to go to Emma Goldman. And Emma Goldman remains to many as much an enigma today as she did when she lived. She was an 1885 emigre to America from Russia. She lived with her sister and her sister's family in Rochester, New York, working initially, as many did, in the Russian Jewish garment workers area. She left Russia, which was her first act of rebellion, because she did not like the restrictiveness of growing up as one of 5 children in an Orthodox Jewish home where marriages were arranged. She had witnessed the Bolshevik uprising, and that really helped to shape her romance with activism. But what really, really radicalized her was learning of the police action against the IWW, or the Wobblies, in the Haymarket area square in Chicago in 1886. So she needed to gain citizenship, and she married a husband of her choice in 1887 by the last name of Kurtzner. However, he became denaturalized in 1908, and because he was stripped of his U.S. citizenship, it would later impact Goldman's citizenship. So after the trial and all of this with the Haymarket trial was over, she left her husband of 2 years and moved to New York City because she wanted to be where the action was. She wanted to be where she could use her multilingual skills of Russian, German, Yiddish, and English to advocate for immigrants, the underserved, the disadvantaged populations, and could rebel again through political movement involvement. Her literal and figurative love affairs with socialists and communists earned her descriptors such as a woman who prefers hell to heaven, an apostle of discord and dynamite, a nuisance to society, the high priestess of anarchy, and Red Emma. She started working as a homeless nurse after she realized that nurses really could travel about the city without harassment. And she couldn't find some place really to live because in 1901, she had been arrested as a person of interest who had potentially influenced the assassin of President William McKinley. So in her ability to move around, she was able to take care of the indigent. She championed the rights of women to experience free love. So did Margaret Sanger. She became a full participant as recognized citizens, married or single. Emma Goldman fought for this. And although initially she was not a suffragist, the reason that she was not was because in her view, the movement was short-sighted because it neglected to adequately represent working women. She argued in her essay on women's suffrage that there's no reason whatsoever that woman, in her climb to emancipation, has been or will be helped by the vote. Following her arrest for inciting to riot and year-long incarceration in Blackwell Island Penitentiary, she served her sentence there, working in the infirmary, and she completed her radicalization while visiting the library. In 1894, she worked in a physician's office, and then in 1895, she returned to Europe to study nursing and midwifery. She then returned to this country and nursing became an integral part of her identity. She advocated for women's health, such as maternal infant issues, the issues of maternal infant mortality, the use of birth control. She cared for patients with TB and with drug issues. But in 1905, she got tired of nursing. It was too hard. It was too hard to work. And she wanted to devote all of her energies to the labor issues. And so that's what she did. She was deported in 1919, again, for her political views and her involvement with socialism and communism. So who was another voice? Okay, let's go back to Rochester. Hattie Frances Kruger was unknown to me, I have to say, before I started my research on this paper and this talk. But the same might be said for many of you who are attending this conference as well. She lived in Buffalo for a number of years, and she then moved also to Rochester. But this picture shows her in 1917. There was some debate in the sources of where she was born. One source, McGarity and Pollitt, attribute her to being born in Buffalo in 1885, whereas Siciliano credits her birth city as Munich, Germany. Regardless of where she was born, she received her nursing education and student training at Buffalo General Hospital School of Nursing, and the records revealed that she completed some of her student clinical experience at the Erie County Almshouse in Buffalo at the turn of the 20th century in 1901. So she worked in Haverstraw, New York as a chief nurse at the New York State Hospital for the care of crippled and deformed children. She worked at Staten Island Hospital, where she met her husband, Thomas Maynard, and she became politically active as a suffragist and as a mover and shaker in the Socialist Party for 8 years, from 1912 to 1920. So just like Lavinia Dock, she participated as a silent sentinel in the crowd standing outside the White House in November of 1917. And like Dock, she wasn't arrested and incarcerated. She was incarcerated at the Oconquan Workhouse, which was a notoriously awful workhouse and prison, and she survived the, quote, night of terror, end quote. The prison superintendent ordered that the 33 arrested suffragists that night were being to subject them to chaining, to clubbing, beatings, chokings, kicks, twists, punchings, and draggings. You get the picture. One woman who was observed by another woman having her head smashed into a brick wall and then falling unconscious, the woman who witnessed that thought that this woman was killed. And so the woman who was observing this action ended up having a heart attack. Kruger stayed there in jail for 16 days, participating in hunger strikes, and she was finally released in a very weakened condition. They never let her go to the courthouse to serve as a witness against what happened because she was so emaciated. They felt that it would skew the jury. So she eventually made her way back to her hospital nursing position, but in 1922, she was fired because of her political activity. So she decided to run for New York State Treasurer on the Socialist Party ticket and lost. So that sort of soured her to politics, and she retired from politics and worked on being a wife and mother and keeping her home on Staten Island, which is where she lived until her death in 1975. I mentioned earlier Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was an activist and an advocate for many issues. She saw what it was like, what her mother went through having 10 living children and several more miscarriages. She saw what it did to her mother's physical health and her mental health, and she was determined at a very early age to stop it. As a nurse, she opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. She and her sister, who was also a nurse, provided care and education on safe sex and birth control. But this is kind of what got Sanger into trouble, because she violated the Comstock law, which said that only physicians could talk about birth control. So this caused her to be arrested and a brief shutdown of her clinic. But she evaded arrest by escaping through Canada to Europe, where she learned about open marriages, free love, women's enfranchisement, and became involved in that movement over there. And she eventually, when her sentence would have been expunged, she came back to the United States because statute of limitations ran out. And she conducted an open marriage. She reopened her birth control clinic and talked about contraception. And this picture here on the right shows her. She self-muzzled at a conference because she again was blocked from teaching about birth control. So she added her voice to the enfranchisement movement. She wasn't the only New York nurse that did that. Ida Bell Samuel Toms did likewise. She was a graduate of the Lincoln Home and Hospital School of Nursing in Harlem, and she was a vocal advocate for the rights of nurses and women of color. She and Mary Mahoney and Ellie, her name just went right out of my mind. She was one of 3 nurses. I can see her picture, but her name just went right out of my mind. That formed the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. As a spokesman for that organization, she recognized that enfranchisement for all women would enhance all of their voices, and by extension, the voices of nurses of color. She knew how to lobby. She championed the admission of Black nurses into the military, and here you see 9 of the Black, who came to be known as the Black 18. There were 18 nurses who were titularly accepted into the Army Nurse Corps, but were precluded from serving overseas because there was no segregated housing overseas. So they were billeted to Camp Sherman in the United States and helped to care for soldiers who were suffering during the flu pandemic. And she championed the cause of nurses and the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses her entire life and career. So who else? Lillian Wald. This shows her in her student uniform. And she then went on. She became aware of the tenements. She became aware of the inequality of care as a nursing student. And she went back and with her fellow alumna, Mary Brewster, created the Henry Street Settlement. But she was more than that. She was born in Ohio to a well-situated middle-class family who eventually moved to Rochester. Note the theme. She wanted to make a difference in the world, and she chose nursing as her way to make that difference. She applied to, was accepted, and graduated from the New York Hospital School of Nursing in 1902. And as I said, her initial exposure to tenement life came during this education. She subsequently returned to the tenements where she and Mary Brewster lived together in the tenements and worked among the inhabitants to provide health care. Now, many of you here, I'm sure, today are familiar with the Henry Street Settlement, which still exists as a museum. But the work of Wald and nurses that she hired morphed into the Visiting Nurses Association of New York. So if you're unfamiliar with her work, just Google her. Take a look at what she did. As the head of the settlement, she learned how to approach potential donors and philanthropists such as Jacob Schiff. She developed a reputation for being fair-minded, tenacious, and a woman who was a successful advocate for the marginalized, under or non-represented residents of the tenement and for immigrants to New York City. In 1913, she wrote the following in a letter responding to the question about women's honesty. She wrote, quote, "The best women are coming to be practical idealists. They do not get sentimental about their ideals. They make them practical working forces. Men and women are equal, but that does not mean identical." Think about that for a minute. Men and women are equal, but that does not mean identical. She goes on, "Given a big outlet, women do big things. They moralize in constructive social work. They stand ready to make political life profit by having a spiritual force added to politics." She was noticed by members of the New York State Woman Suffrage Party and the American Union Against Militarism. The former group advocated for suffrage and U.S. involvement in the Great War. The latter group focused on peaceful solutions to the war and standing against conscription or the draft, and standing against military preparedness. Wald chose membership in the latter organization. And as Goodyear et al. Discovered in their work, these suffragists participated in peaceful activism, marching in the suffrage parades and the anti-war protests prior to our involvement, and even after we got into the Great War. For their efforts, these women were accused of being socialists. This picture, somewhere in here, is Lillian Wald and many other women who marched on August 29th, 1914. August 29th, 1914, to protest our becoming involved. There were 1,500 women in this parade. They were wearing yellow flowers. Some marched in the mourning garb of the day. Others you can see have on the white, which was the color of the suffrage movement. The other two colors of the suffrage movement were purple and yellow. Many of the nurses, as I said, worked in this march had worked at the Henry Street Settlement. So what lessons have we learned from the struggle for enfranchisement from 100 years ago to now? One of the lessons learned from the protracted struggle for enfranchisement is the power of perseverance to obtain a goal. We as nurses had to persevere through our nursing education at a diploma level, at an associate degree level, at a baccalaureate level, at a master's level, at a doctorally prepared level. We had to persevere. To put the struggle of suffrage into some current context, think about this for a moment, if you will. Nurses and nursing leaders in New York State championed, presented evidence-based research, rallied, petitioned their state legislators, and lobbied for over 30 years to achieve passage of the BS in 10 legislation. And we thought that was a long time. Our foremothers and suffragette supporters fought the good fight for 90 years. 9 decades they fought. That, I submit, is a testament to perseverance. So, in conclusion, our foremothers and forefathers advocating for suffrage issued a call to action through the decades of their advocacy for enfranchisement. Lavinia Dock linked gaining the vote with nursing becoming a profession. The 2017 National Nursing Workforce data reveal that we, professional registered nurses, number 3.8 million souls at that time. That is an enormous voting bloc, providing we're all registered to vote, because voting is our civic and, as our nurse foremothers have pointed out, our professional responsibility. As Phoebe Pollitt wrote in the conclusion of her article, quote, "The right to vote is fragile and can be suppressed if we are not vigilant in persevering this right for all citizens. To honor these strong, intelligent, and brave suffragists, nurses must register to vote, cast our ballots, and run for office." As our time here comes to a close, I am going to leave you with some words from one of my heroes and role models, the late Congressman John Robert Lewis. At Emory University in 2014, when addressing the graduating class, he quoted his aunt who said, "Make the way out of no way," which is exactly what we've been doing during this COVID pandemic. Continuing with Lewis's words in the 2018 commencement address at Boston University, he shared his philosophy of life. And I'm sure that if we were in a live audience, many of you would be joining me. And if you want to join at home and say with me, that is absolutely wonderful. He said, "When you see something that is not right, that is not fair, that is not just, you have a moral obligation to say something, to do something, to stand up, to speak out." This is what he charged that graduating class to do. John Lewis charged anyone who would listen to, quote, "Be bold, be courageous, and speak out," end quote. Is that not what Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony did as citizens and as women? Is that not what Lillian Wald, Harriet Tubman, Hattie Francis Kruger, Emma Goldman, Lavinia Dock, Ida Bell Samuel Toms, and Margaret Sanger did as citizens, as women, as nurses? I ask you this question. Should we do any less? As nurses, be bold, be courageous, speak out in your communities, speak out in your places of employment, speak out for your patients, and speak out at the ballot box. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Trudy.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that rousing ending, Trudy. It certainly inspires us in us, especially at this time. It's 7:25 on Tuesday, September 29th, that in approximately 1.5 hours, we should have our cup of tea to sit before our television sets and get more informed on our vote that we need to cast in this upcoming election.
Amen to that.
I don't see any questions. Does anyone have any particular questions? You can type it in the chat box, or there is a question and answer box as well. In the meantime, I guess I would ask you, Trudy, what led you to your own interest in the history of nursing?
Oh my goodness. I got bitten with the history bug, if you will, from probably the time I was 5 or 6 years old. We had great discussions around our family dining room tables. I did not realize that my father was born in the 19th century. His first wife had died, his son had died. He met my mother and had a second family. We knew when Daddy was born as far as month and day, but not year. So I did not know any of this. And I thought, oh, wow, Daddy really learned a whole bunch from learning history in school. What he was telling us was his lived experiences, his public history, the lived experiences, good and bad. And so I was bit with that. So I always loved nursing. That is one of my 4 passions and still is in my life, as is history. How I became interested in nursing history was just really looking at women's history, and then also being hired at the Center for Nursing in Guilderland and learning the rich history of nursing. So it was like, oh, wow, okay, I'm there, you know. And I'm still that way. And I am passionate, and I share this with my students. And it is so important. I would love to develop a history of nursing course here at Sage. That's one of my dreams.
Well, let's do it together at Nazareth. We'll do a co-tour, because you know Nazareth College and the Sages, now Russell Sage College, are 2 of the new American colleges and universities. We belong to a consortium. So
Right.
Speaking of colleges and undergraduate nursing courses, where would you put political advocacy in an undergraduate or graduate nursing program?
Wow. Definitely it belongs. Just as nursing history belongs in both disciplines. Starting out learning, I bring it in talking in my nursing 201, which is the nursing theory course, and it is here at Russell Sage. It is one of what we call the triplet. So it's linked nursing theory, nursing fundamentals, and nursing assessment at the 200 level, their first semester of nursing courses. And one of the things that I require, one of the assignments I require, is to have my students attend at least 2 professional organizational meetings in a semester, and then write up a guided reflection. What did you learn about professionalism at the meeting? What did you learn about leadership at the meeting? How is that going to impact your student practice? How is that going to impact your professional practice? So I started there, because at many of the meetings, they do talk about legislation that's coming up. They do talk about advocacy. They do talk about social determinants of health. So they're getting that at that 200 level. And I tell them, you know, this is part of your professional responsibility. And being aware of what's happening at the legislative level, being involved in your organizations, such as ANA New York, such as ANA, such as the New York organization, Professional Nurses, NINIPNO. If you're in leadership, you know, NIONAL or NINIONAL, I point out to them, if you want to end up into a specialty belonging to that organization. So I, am saying to them from an early point, get involved in your professional organizations.
Great.
So that's a way to introduce that.
Well, speaking from Rochester, and Rochester is known as the cradle of nursing, and you mentioned Sophia Palmer, who I think if Ms. Kathleen Britton knows the exact years, but who for a number of years, I think 3 decades, published the first American Journal of Nursing out of her apartment first in Rochester, New York.
She did.
What do you think made Rochester such a hotbed of social activism?
I honestly don't know. I think, well, part of it, I think, and just to tag on with Sylvia Palmer, Sylvie Nye, who was friends with Palmer, really were the ones that pushed, women's clubs and said, we have to have a nursing organization, which eventually came into be the New York State Nurses Association. But they advocated for that in 1901. So I think what it was its proximity to Seneca Falls, the fact that, Rochester was a hub. So, people would come to Rochester. And I think that was part of it. That, and it could be, I know I don't mean this to sound in any way trite because it's not, but many times in the winter, what else did you do? What did you do in upstate New York? What did you do in Rochester? What did you do? You would get together with your women friends and you would talk and you would debate. And you would have what they would call in some cities salons, where you would come and you would debate political issues. And so you had women who were involved in their churches, and out of that, they gained experience in advocating and the social issues that many of the churches and many of the women and many of the mission organizations would take on. So I think that could be part of it. I've actually never done a study on what was the nexus for that. Not that that sounds like something that could be very interesting to learn about. But I'm just kind of looking at the social aspect, of what was going on and all of that at the time.
Part just speaking as one of the resident history people,
Yes.
Part of what made Rochester such a hotbed was the fact that it was part of what was known as the burned over district, because what you had here was all sorts of activism and other sorts of reform movements. The Mormon church began over in Palmyra, just 45 minutes away. You also had the United Community close by, spiritualism. There was all sorts of stuff going on here. So it made for a good hotbed for suffrage, for I just lost my word, for temperance, for all sorts of the movements that were very social reform movements of the 19th century, excuse me.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for
Another
that
question is, what is your take on what seems to be apathy among nurses in the current age of, the third wave of feminism?
Well, if you look back at this whole process, and you look back in 1840, there were nurses who said, I don't have time. I don't need to vote. My husband can vote for me. I don't need to vote. I'm too busy with my patients. My focus is nursing. That's all I care about. And there were many nurses who were not active, and in fact were considered anti-suffragists. They could not understand why nurses would want, or why women as a gender would want the vote. So there were many, I didn't mean to paint the picture that all nurses were painted with the same stripe, because they weren't. There were many who were anti-suffragists.
Are there any women that you could point to who would be good leaders, role models, inspirations in this time in the current political climate?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of them's on the call tonight. I mean, one's here, and that's Janine Santelli. As the executive director of A&A New York, you know, her office is right down there, and she's over, you know, in the Capitol quite often. She's got her pulse on what's going on, and she is more than willing. She has mentored some of our capstone students from Sage. She loves.
She mentored me. Hi, Janine.
She absolutely, I mean, she looks at it as part of who she is to cultivate that passion for legislation and that passion for political involvement. If you look at, well, just the other night, we had a Women's Institute meeting, and we had women on there like Dr. Alice Green and Kirsten Gillibrand, and yes, they were not nurses, but you take a look, Poll Congress. I'm sorry that right now I can't put my finger on the number of nurses who are in our federal Congress, but take a look at that. You know, they also, from all over the country, you know, are willing to mentor young men and women to go into politics as a voice for nursing and bringing that voice to the table.
And certainly, I think in this age of COVID-19, nurses have taken on a much more public face. Their leadership, their heroism is much more recognized. We know the Gallup poll, except in 2000, you know, 9/11, 2001, that nurses have always been at the top of who is the most trusted profession.
That's correct.
So I think sometimes we need to take the fire that you've put in our bellies tonight and remember that our voice does have power. The culture shift that you talked to us about offers great hope for today and for going forward. We all have the opportunity to, in very small ways, to make a difference. Our voice is our vote. And we need to think about what our foremothers sacrificed, what they went through in order to allow us to have a voice.
Right.
So tonight we're most grateful to your presentation on the meaningful role of nurses and their role in suffrage. We thank you again to our sponsors, Rochester Regional Health, St. John Fisher Wegman School of Nursing, Nazareth College Nursing, Westside Medical Supply, and of course, A&A New York. As Miss Allerton would remind her students, evaluation is the final part of the nursing process. Amen. So for those of you who want nursing continuing education, we hope you'll all complete the evaluation that you should receive by email. Additionally, we hope that as a result of your inspiring voice that you gave us, Trudy, tonight, that all of you will look forward to the 3rd annual Eva Allerton lecture next fall. And with that, good night and happy debate watch.
If I have
you want to say
minute,
one more thing? Yes.
There was a couple questions here in the chat. One of them, preserving, from Karen Wolf. Preserving our current history is so important now. How would you envision involving students and other nurses in preserving this? I would and have argued for, you know, colleges having archives to preserve their histories. Russell Sage College School of Nursing is going to be celebrating 100 years in 2022. And so a project that I spearheaded and that Dr. Glenda Kelman is working with me on is collecting oral histories of graduates and recalling their times at Sage, whatever years they graduated, how were they prepared to take on their future profession. looking at what they've done since their graduation. And Monday, one of the sections of my nursing theory course had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Karen Drenkard, who, you know, is a fellow in the Academy of American Nursing. She has been on the credentialing boards. She's made a big impact, and she's a SAGE grad, and she talked to the students. I mean, it was amazing. And it was a group project. So I had the class split up in groups. Each group asked a number of questions and follow-up. That's going to repeat again on Thursday. Another way then that I'm involving my students, and to preserve that, is I'm having Thursday's group listen to Monday's interview and critique it. And I'm having Thursday's group, or Monday's group, then listen to the interview that Thursday will do and critique it. So that they can learn, one, what it was like to interview and what it was like to evaluate, to do a peer review, and what it's like to be a peer reviewer, and see if you can pick out common themes. That's one thing. Kathleen asked if I can recommend any biographies or history of nursing books that would inform someone wanting to learn more. Would it be possible to have a copy of this presentation to share with classes? As far as the books, I need to consult my bookshelf, which I won't do tonight, but I could include some books and send it, you know, if you want to contact me, anybody wants to contact me offline. The other thing is, I mean, you know, to my email is what I'm trying to say. And so I can do that as far as some biographies or some seminal works that can help with that. And a copy of this presentation to share with classes, yes, but I will copyright it. I will have all the references properly cited in the reference list. It's a work in progress. They're all there, but they're not put in an APA format. So I'll get that done in APA format. But yes, as long as, you know, because it will be copyrighted as my work. So it can be shared, but as long as I'm acknowledged with it, that I will allow that. Okay. So what do you think are the leading, who are, okay, we answered that one. What made Rochester, we answered that one. Where political advocacy could fall. And Elaine Marshall, is that the Elaine Marshall from AAHN, Elaine Marshall?
Not
She
sure.
can't answer you, but she can type it up. So Elaine, type it if that's
Elaine,
you.
is that?
Because you're an old Susan B. Anthony House person too.
Okay, but if it's the Elaine Marshall, I think I know. Wow. I'm so glad you're here.
Yes.
It is. Cool. Oh my gosh, we haven't seen each other in several years, but I'll see you October 3rd at the AAHN meeting. So that's wonderful. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay. Little things that get me excited. Okay. So I think I answered. I just didn't want to miss any questions.
No, I think they were in two different places. So
Okay.
I'm glad you saw those extra ones.
That's fine. Oh my gosh. Okay. Wonderful. Well, go vote. All right. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this.
And thank you. We really appreciate your highlighting Rochester.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.